Both the fundamental rights and directive principles have common origin and common objective for the establishment of the welfare state and a just state. Within this fold, the fundamental rights provide a foundation for the political democracy in India, whereas the directive principles spell out the character of the social economic democracy. Fundamental rights are in the form of negative obligations of the state, injunctions against the actions of the state, within the nature of the denial of certain authority to the state. Directive principles are, on the contrary, positive obligations of the state towards the citizens. They are like positive direction the government at all levels must follow to contribute to the establishment of socio-economic democracy in India. A vital difference between the two is that while the fundamental rights are justiciable and enforceable by the court of law, directive principles are non-justiciable. In other words, the Supreme Court and the High Courts have the powers to issue order or risk for the enforcement of the fundamental rights. Fundamental rights cannot be denied to any citizen. The directive principle of state policy, on the other hand, confer no legal rights to sanction and get no legal remedies. No constitutional provision or laws by the government to implement this. Even in respect of the placement of in the constitution, the directive principles comes after the fundamental rights. It means that importance of fundamental rights is more than that of directive principles. Relation between fundamentals and complementary. Since the directive principles is a wide objective of the state which cannot be enforced in a court of law, while the fundamental rights are just judicially enforceable, the question as to what happens if one conflicts with other, it is a difficult question which the court have for a long time have struggled to answer. The first phase, 1959, is directive principles are subsidiary and subordinate to fundamental rights. So what they mean are subordinate to the fundamental state of Champakam Durai Rajan case versus state of Madras. Initially, the judiciary adopted a strict legal position, taking a literal interpretative approach of Article 37 and Article 32, and held that directive principles are subordinate to the fundamental rights, and in case of inconsistency between the two, the fundamental rights would prevail over the directive principles. Okay, this point was settled by the Supreme Court in state of Madras versus Champakam Durai Rajan case, where the court invalidated an order which provided for reservation of seats for admission into a state educational institution to backward caste, even though it was inspired by Article 46. According to the court, since fundamental rights were enforceable and directive principles were not, the laws implementing the directive principle could not abrogate the fundamental rights. The directive principles should run subsidiary and conform to the fundamental rights. In Venkatraman versus State of Madras, also the same points was reiterated and said that the Madras government's order to give preference to the scheduled caste and backward classes were held to be unconstitutional, for it was discriminatory in relation to other classes. To overcome the course hindrance for the socio-economic reforms, the government passed the First Amendment Act in 1951, which allowed the state to make any special prohibitions for the advancement of socially and educationally backward classes. It also inserted Article 31A and Article 31B along with the 9th schedule in the Constitution, which providing for acquisition of each state land against violation of the fundamental rights. This clearly implied that the directive principles were no less important than the fundamental rights. But the courts continued their approach of strict literal interpretation, or rather narrow interpretation of their space. For example, in Bela Banerjee case, the court again upheld fundamental rights against directive principles in the matter of providing just compensation to to land acquired by the state for social purpose. Initially, the judiciary adopted a strict legal position, taking a literal interpretative approach to Article 37 and held that directive principles are subordinate to the fundamental rights and held that directive principles are subordinate to the fundamental rights, and in case of an inconsistency between the two, the fundamental right would prevail over the directive principles. Okay, so this point was settled by the Supreme Court in State of Madras versus Champakam Durai Rajan case, where the court invalidated an order which provided for reservation of seats for admission into a state educational institution to backward classes, even though it was inspired by Article 46. According to the court's fundamental Guys, I will be back in 10 minutes. I have some important work.